Now, currently in Tunisia, the country's most powerful labor union has announced a general strike that will result in the cancellation of all international flights to and from the country. It is set to also halt land and sea transportation. Now, according to the Tunisian General Labor Union, the action will take place on 16th of June. It will include about 15 transportation companies and the cancellation of 49 flights. Now, the union's statement said that state-owned companies' employees should not cross the picket line. They are protesting against President Kais Saied's decision to freeze wages as part of the government deal to secure a $4 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. Economic experts reported that the general strike, which will last about 24 hours, will cost the country's economy an estimated $65 million. Tunisia's inflation reached 7.8% this month, which is the highest in 30 years, while the country has faced a political deadlock since July 2021, when President Saied suspended the parliament and later dissolved it. Well, let's discuss the state of affairs in the country with Fadel Khaboub. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University in the U.S. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Khaboub. Now, of course, let's start off with that IMF loan, because it is the reason the reforms that will come with that IMF loan are the reason for the protest. Can Tunisia's government, first and foremost, avoid public financial bankruptcy without that $4 billion loan?
Well, thanks for having me back on the show. Well, the Tunisian debt crisis is a structural issue going on for decades, and it's actually very similar to many countries in the global south. And what the IMF, the government, and also the labor unions fail to acknowledge and recognize is that we can't really democratize a system that hasn't been economically and structurally decolonized yet. So this debt crisis is the consequence of decades of failed economic policies. So your question, can the government avoid all of these cuts and manage to muddle through this crisis without an IMF loan? It's possible, but it will come at a cost of massive devaluation of the Tunisian dinar, which means massive inflation, because most of our inflation is imported via food imports and energy imports and medical equipment imports. So these are the structural deficiencies that the IMF loan will simply act as a band-aid to temporarily relieve this pain. But in 3 to 5 years, Tunisia will be exactly in the same spot with similar debt crisis level and similar demands from the IMF. So the IMF is wrong in terms of its demands to freeze salaries and to keep the status quo, essentially. The government is wrong in the sense that it doesn't have an alternative vision for economic development in Tunisia. And the labor unions are also wrong in the sense that they are not calling for structural reforms that will actually make the economic system more prosperous, and as a result will allow unions to get a better and bigger share of the pie. So we have a huge blind spot when it comes to what is actually structurally causing this crisis.
Well, on that note then, what are your thoughts on this protest plan for tomorrow? Is it futile in its attempt to stop the IMF deal and, of course, the reforms that will come with it? And some say it is a reaction to the government's reluctance to dialogue with some of these workers. What are your thoughts on it?
So the strike and the demands by the labor unions are legitimate demands. There's no denying it. It's not reasonable for the working class in Tunisia to that have suffered significantly since the 2010-2011 uprisings. 10 consecutive governments have not really delivered on the economic front to the Tunisian economy, to the working people. So it's not reasonable that the economic relief from the IMF comes on the backs of working class people, and in addition to many concessions that have been given to the IMF since the Ben Ali regime and further regimes in the last 10 years. So these are legitimate demands, but it doesn't come with solutions. It comes with objections and no structural transformation vision from the government or from the labor unions, and certainly not from the IMF.
All right. Well, it looks like that strike is set to happen tomorrow. When we talk about how damaging it will be, as we mentioned, 65 million it will cost the economy. But how damaging do you think it will be to the negotiations with the IMF and, of course, the country's economic future?
I don't think it will be damaging to the negotiations with the IMF. If anything, it's a good reminder for the IMF to acknowledge that these demands are unacceptable, unacceptable in Tunisia, unacceptable in Egypt, unacceptable in Sri Lanka and other places. And hopefully this will open the conversation for what are the structural solutions that we need to put on the table. And to me, it's very clear. The root causes of this external debt are the lack of food sovereignty. Tunisia imports most of its food internationally, and of course imports at a higher cost today because of the pandemic, because of the Ukraine crisis. Tunisia also imports most of its energy, like most countries in the global south. So of course our inflation is related to the conflict in the Ukraine and global commodity prices going through the roof. So how can Tunisia prevent these kind of build resilience to these external shocks on the food front, on the energy front, by investing in food sovereignty? Tunisia used to be the breadbasket for the French Empire, and now we rely on food imports. We invest in renewable energy. We leapfrog into a clean energy era, and as a result, build resilience and prevent future external debt deals that will be necessary to fuel Tunisia's economic activity. You can't have a functioning economy without food, without energy. So the deal with the IMF should be, let's have immediate relief now so we can move through this crisis, but at the same time, let's have strategic investments to rebuild food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, and that will be the ultimate solution to Tunisia's debt crisis. Like many other countries, to be honest, in the global south, they also need these structural reforms. Africa imports 85% of its food. The most fertile continent on the planet is food dependent because of post-colonial structures that were imposed by the global north.
Well,
that's why I keep saying you can't democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. So we have to acknowledge these deep structural traps that have been set up for the African continent since the early days after independence. I'll give you an example. As soon as the African continent became independent from the former empires, the Europeans looked around and said, we can't depend on Africans for our food. So they invested in the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which heavily subsidized farmers in Europe and made it impossible for African farmers to compete. So we lost our core staples and we became food dependent. And now we only export cash crops. So we can't have a well-functioning economy without agriculture, without energy, and ideally with clean energy, because similarly, we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. So these are the big challenges for the continent, for Tunisia, and the IMF has to recognize this, and the global north has to recognize that we can't function under the current international trade and international finance architecture. We're constantly going to have these external debt cycles for the global south.